Thank you for listening to A Glimpse of the Kingdom. A Glimpse of the Kingdom can remain free because of generous donors like you. If you'd like to donate, feel free to do so online, or you can send payments through Facebook Messenger. Don't forget to tell your friends about it so that they can enjoy this ministry as well. Be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any podcasts.
You can listen to my daddy every single day, like in the gym, in the car, or just at home. Glimpse of the Kingdom is awesome!
Hello, thank you for listening to A Glimpse of the Kingdom. I'm David Pendergrass. I received an email from a listener named Chris. Chris has been talking with various people, and one particular non-believer response that he receives about moral values or something, or just anything existing objectively, they disagree. And he was said that usually an unbeliever says something like this: you have to prove that it objectively exists. And since people will disagree on certain matters, on what they prefer or value, you can't really make an objective claim unless you can provide one when you judge others on what they value. And he says he's getting different answers to this question. He said he recently talked to a Christian and asked him 4 questions. So I think what Chris is struggling with is when someone's talking about God or morality and you say something objectively exists, if you don't agree upon the idea that something objectively exists, what do you say? And that is a common response by people who pretend to be relativist. I say pretend because I've never met an actual relativist. They just pretend to be. And that's a different story. But anyway, people who are relatives say objective morality or objective things don't exist. It's only your perception that things exist, which means there's nothing objective at all, which means it's a way to argue against God and argue against the typical Christian argument for morality. So he apparently asks this other person various questions, these 4 issues. But before these 4 questions are asked, I'm going to try to respond. He has a little paragraph here. And here's what Chris said that a fellow Christian said in response to try to help him out. But Chris was not happy. He was a little more confused by these answers by a Christian. The Christian said this, whoever this other Christian is, quote, "It is correct. You cannot demonstrate one," he means objective claim. "You cannot demonstrate one because there is no universally objective standard that exists. Even if one did exist, we have no way to know what it is other than our own subjective impressions of how we interpret it. So there's no point talking about an objective standard. Let me be clear, when Christians talk about absolute truth or objective standards, they're talking about God's truth and God's standards. However, they make the crucial mistake of putting God in a box. They assume that there was only one possible way God could have made the world, and that he could not have possibly chosen any other moral standard. This will make more sense in a second, period," end quote. I'm not real sure what in the world this Christian is talking about. I mean, this is full of all kinds of different ideas, and I'm not trying to be mean. I'm really mean. I don't know what he's talking about. For example, when you say no universally objective standard exists, my next question is going to be, do you think that statement is true or false? I mean, of course he thinks that statement's true, which means he's assuming there is a thing called logic or truth. That is an objective standard that exists to which he's appealing. He's arguing a case. He's arguing a point. And whenever you argue a point, you're assuming truth exists because you think you have it and you're trying to correct something that's false. And that's why every single time anybody ever says there's no such thing as objective truth or objective morality, it's immediately self-contradictory, because you have to assume there's truth when you're making the argument. So that's the first thing I'd say is I don't know what that means, and I disagree with him completely. I think there are numerous universal objective standards throughout existence to which humans appeal all the time. I think mathematics are universally objective. I think logic is universally objective. There are multiple moral values that are universally objective. Anyway, in the next sentence he says, if one did exist, we have no way to know what it is other than our own subjective impressions of how to interpret it. I don't know exactly what that means, but I think what he means is we wouldn't know it besides how we interpret it or how we experience it. To that I would say, of course that's correct. Of course that's correct. And that's why specialists make a distinction between what we call moral ontology or moral epistemology. Moral ontology has to do with the grounding of moral values and duties. The grounding. It means it's the independent value of something. The epistemology is how one comes to know something, how one comes to be aware of moral values and duties, and then and how they determine what they are. So that's okay. I think that 2 plus 2 equals a 4-ness, a 4 quality. Now, what scribbly lines you use for the 4, that's fine. I know how I write the number 4, but I could use 17 dots or whatever. I mean, the point is, the squiggly line of 4 can be however you want it to be, but the concept of 4-ness, that 2 and 2 of these things equal a 4-ness quality, is objective. Now, I experience it by using the number of what I call 4. So my experience of it is different. I know that the past existed. I know that I've been saying words on this recording. I have evidence of it. But you could always argue, no, that recording is false and make-believe. Or what happened 10 years ago, I don't have evidence of it. I'm not there. Well, of course not. I experienced it. And my subjective experience of an objective past is how I know anything about the past. And I trust it. I trust that the past actually existed. I don't think I was born yesterday. I think I was born a long time ago. Anyway, so when he says there's no point in talking about objective standard, I completely disagree. We have every good reason to talk about objective standard. When he says Christians talk about absolute truth or objective standards, they're really talking, or he didn't say they're really, he says they're talking about God's truth and God's standard. That's true. That is, God is, in Christianity, God is the source of what we call truth. He's the source of what we call objective standards. That's correct. Which is very bizarre to me, because he just said there's no reason, there's no point in talking about objective standard, and then he tells us that God is the standard. Well, if there's no point in talking about objective standard, that means we shouldn't talk about God. But that's silly. And even this guy, later on you'll see, even this guy thinks that's silly too. He believes in God. So I don't understand anything he's saying. And this last part about God, mistake, they make the crucial mistake. I'm not sure who they are. I guess he says Christians. I guess he means all Christians. I mean, that's billions of Christians around the globe. So he thinks billions of Christians around the globe make the mistake of putting God in a box. I don't know what that means, because God can't be put into a box. I guess he means the metaphor that we limit God somehow, but we don't limit God. God cannot be limited. So I don't know what he means by that. I know it's a common expression, but I don't like that expression because it doesn't make any sense to me. You don't put God in anything. You're either aware of what God is, of who God is and what he can do, or you're not aware. I don't know what the box part means. Anyway, then he says they assume there's only one possible way God could have made the world. Well, maybe, but I'm a Christian, and I don't think there's only one possible way God could have made the world. I think God could have made the world any way he wanted to. So I'm at least one Christian who breaks away from his mold of all Christians making a mistake. And then he changes the subject and says, I don't know if he realizes this, and he says, could have made the world, and that he could not have possibly chosen any other moral standard. Well, those are very different things. In philosophy, when we say God made the world, we can mean either God made this literal earth. Yes, God could have made this literal earth in different ways. It could have been different shapes and so forth. But in philosophy, it's also used to mean a reality. When God makes this world, he means all reality. What we might say, the universe and everything. A possible world. But when he talks about a moral standard, that's very different. So when he says he could not have possibly chosen any other moral standard. So this guy thinks that Christians are mistaken. He thinks that Christians are mistaken when we say that God could not have possibly chosen any other moral standard. Now, right off the face value, prima facie on face value, I absolutely disagree with him. I do not think God could have chosen any other moral standard, and I do not think I'm mistaken by holding that view. I don't think I'm putting God in a box, whatever that means, to hold that view. But he says this will make more sense in a second. So let's see if it makes more sense, and we'll try to give the Christian a shot of if I understand his message. So that's just the opening paragraph. I won't detail the rest as much. But question number 1: now some of the grammar is not just right. But the first question is, I think he means, how are moral judgments all subjective? His answer is, the Christian's answer is, because arguing that an objective standard exists is the same as placing something above God. that there is some set of rules that transcend God against which all things can be measured. Let me stop there and say that's false. That's false. That's not what it means to say there's an objective standard that exists. That is false. If you say there's an objective standard that exists, which is more authoritative God, well, then you're saying that. But all you have to say is the objective standard which exists is God's character. Well, then you're not placing anything above God. So right off the bat, that's false. That's not what it inherently means. He continues, this also means that God is subject to judgment by that standard and that God might not be objectively good, or in the alternative, God is only objectively good because he measures up to the higher standard, which once again puts the standard as a higher authority than God. End quote. My response there is, right, if there is a standard to which God appeals. We have no reason to think that God appeals to a standard. We have every reason to think God appeals to his own character, you might say. God just behaves. He doesn't appeal to anything or anyone outside of himself. Okay, he continues, quote, but when we say that God is the one who sets the standard, he could have set the standard as anything he wanted. He could say, for example, go attack the Amalekites and totally destroy everything that belongs to them. Do not spare them. Put to death men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys. That's from 1 Samuel 15, 2-3. Most people argue that there is an objective standard and that God failed that standard when he called for the deaths of babies. Now, if God makes the standard of good and evil, then we must say this is good, even if we don't understand how or why. Why is it good? Because God did it, and it's pleasing to him that his will be carried out. But if there is an objective standard, then there is some basis for calling God evil for doing this. And yet for the one who calls God evil for doing this, where is he coming up with this objective standard, if not from his own subjective impressions of right and wrong, or even from a subjective collective impression of many people? In short, there is no way of knowing any objective standard. The best way we can know is that God has expressed his own subjective views of right and wrong to us, and because none of us can resist his judgment, we are to treat his standard as if it is objective as to us, even if it was only subjective as to him. As a result, Christians call God's standard objective when it is really a subjective one, but they do so as a practical notion, not in the interest of precision in their word choice. To be clear, there is nothing in the Bible that says, quote, God had to set up right and wrong this particular way, and it was impossible for him to do any other way. It is to our good fortune that God established right and wrong in a manner consistent with his character. Now, let me pause there for a second because he goes on to give an analogy. I think I understand his point, and the part I think I understand, I agree with aspects of it. Other things I just don't understand. I just disagree, I guess, completely. So to say it one more time, Christians, theists, for a long time have not argued that objective standards are impossible to know. We think God is the absolute standard of right and wrong, of truth and false. And so these things go together. He's where it comes from. Then when he gives the biblical examples, when he says he could set a standard as anything he wanted, the answer is no, he could not have set it for anything he wanted because his morality, the morality of right and wrong, comes from God's very character. God cannot be something he is not. So no, he could not have made it anything else. And you say, well, David, that sounds like you're limiting God. No, it's not a limitation on God to be perfect. It's like saying God could not have made a mistake on that math quiz. Well, if God were perfect, he could make a mistake on the math quiz. No, he couldn't, because he's perfect. If I took the vocabulary test of my daughter from her school, I'm going to make 100 on it every single time. It's not because I'm limited. It's because I know perfectly exactly what the answers are on the vocabulary quiz. That's like it is with God. So he could not have made a deficient choice in morality. What he chooses is right. What he disdains is wrong for us. So there you go. That's one thing is moral values. So for example, God values honesty. God values, telling the truth. God values preserving human life and so forth. But just because God values those things doesn't mean God gives us those values to do at all times. Those are called moral duties. Now, I've done all kinds of podcasts on this, and I hope you go listen to them. A moral value is not the same as a moral duty. I We all live every day with various moral values, but we choose which moral value to put into place, and that's called a moral duty. If I go down the road and there's a car that just wrecked and look, there's smoke coming out, I'm going to have, as C.S. Lewis says, different instincts. One instinct is to run. That's a value. That is preserve my human life, preserve my own life. Another value will be to preserve other people's life, so I'll have an instinct that tells me go help the person. I value my family and my children, so I will have an instinct that says don't get hurt because I value them. I'll have a value of being a Christian and want to help serve people. Have various values, or you might say various instincts that come into play immediately. But the moral law doesn't tell us just that we have moral values and moral instincts. We have moral duties. We feel commanded to go do something. And almost always, C.S. Lewis is right here, we almost always choose the instinct or the value that is the one that is least self-survival. That is to say, the one I would feel most compelled to do is to go help the people, even though it causes me danger, potentially cause my life, potentially make my children not have a dad. The moral value, the moral law would tell me, command me inside, you need to go do the right thing. The right thing here is to not obey those other moral values, but obey this particular moral value. That is, go help someone else. So moral duties are different from moral values. Or to say to C.S. Lewis said, moral instincts or moral values are like the keys on a keyboard of a piano. The moral law tells us which ones to push. It tells us which ones to push. So, could God have had other moral values? No. It's like saying, could God have had different notes on the piano keyboard? No. The piano's been designed, period. God's character is set, period, because he just exists. Just period. It's over. Then the question is, does God share the same moral duties that I have? Does God, as it were, you might say, command himself to always pick certain values over other values like he commands me to pick moral values? The answer to that is, it seems pretty clear to me, no. God is not under the same moral obligations as I am. And I've said this in other podcasts, but again, we see this instinctively and we feel it and experience it instinctively all the time. I have the moral value to take care and preserve children. I feel very compelled to make sure children are safe. I have kids over my house all the time with my children, playing all the time. And when they come on my property and they come near, I see them as a son and daughter. I want to take care of them. We feed them. We give them drink. I don't yell at them. I speak kindly to them. I treat them like my own children. And if something were to happen, I'd feel very compelled to take care of them. But if I had to choose between taking care of my kids and their kids when they're at their house, and I chose to take care of my kids, when my kids are my responsibility, I don't feel the moral duty to go take care of everyone else's kids. And if their other parents came down the road and said, my daughter and son are hungry, and they're at their house in their own kitchen, and they started fussing at me, I'd say, why do you think I got to feed them? It's not my moral duty to take care of your children when they're in your care. They're your children. So the moral duty is different. Or another analogy, if you walked down the street and saw me slashing the tires on my truck, you know, David's gone crazy. Well, he's breaking all the moral values. Well, no, I'm not. You'd say it's David's truck. He can do what he wants to. He's under no moral obligation to take care of his truck because he owns it. But as a stranger, the stranger would say, because he's morally literate, the stranger would say, I am under a different moral obligation. My moral duty is to make sure I do not destroy his property. But the owner of the truck is on a different moral obligation. The moral duties are different. The moral commandments are different. That's how it is with God. We are told not to enact vengeance throughout the Bible. For example, all through the Bible, Old and New Testament, do not enact vengeance. Do not enact vengeance. The assumption seems to be, and it always says, because God gives vengeance. But the assumption is that we are not morally perfect. That is, if we enact vengeance, we're going to miss something. Our judgment will not be fair. So we leave vengeance to God. Our moral duty is don't enact vengeance. But God does not have that moral duty. God can, and I would dare say is morally obligated, to enact vengeance or judgment on people that are corrupt and sinful. But I do not have that moral command. And there have been certain small groups of people in the history of the world in Judaism who did believe God gave them the moral imperative to go enact his judgment, like against the Amalekites and other places. Now, that's another issue. I've done podcasts on this. There's great literature on all these kinds of things. But let me say very briefly, one is this kind of vocabulary about killing everything that lives and breathes, children, infants, blah, 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 that's just hyperbole. It's just hyperbole. It's how ancient people talked about warfare. It's just hyperbole. That's it. It doesn't mean sometimes babies weren't killed. It just means in general, that's how they talked about warfare. Secondly, the text demonstrates over and over and over in the Old Testament, that's actually not what they did. They weren't good at that. Because they would say, go kill them, and they'd say, we killed them all, like the next verse says. And then we went and married their daughters and took their cows. I mean, so that's a different issue of exegesis. But just because they thought that God commanded them to do that, and let's assume they were commanded, it does not mean that what they've been commanded is evil, because it is evil to kill babies. Well, anyway, so he's confusing, it seems to me, he's confusing God's moral ontology. God is the right, what God values is right. Moral epistemology, how do we come to know what is right and wrong? That is subjective. And it seems he's also confusing the difference between moral values, which are things like honesty, preservation of human life, fairness, kindness, showing honor, versus moral duties, and that is, what do I do? Which value do I do right now in the moment? So when he says there's no way to know an objective standard, I completely disagree. We do have a way to do it, and that is by our own moral intuition. I know what's right and wrong. I know it's wrong to hurt children for fun. That's wrong. It's wrong to rape. I don't care who you are. I don't care if every person in the whole world tell me it's a good thing. I'm going to say, you're crazy. You're ludicrous. It's wrong. It's evil. Then he goes on. He says, another example. Suppose I create a robot. I program that robot to push a bowl of cereal on the floor. I press the on button, and there it goes. The cereal is now on the floor. I laugh, thinking it's hysterical. My son isn't amused and views the situation as bad because now the house is messy. Is the robot morally good or morally bad? From my son's point of view, the robot just did something bad. From my point of view, it just did something that pleases me. From the robot's point of view, it carried out its task with flawless execution. So where does that leave us? It means that I had a subjective impression of good that my son did not share. It was good to me because it made me laugh, and my amusement has value to me. It also means that the robot has done what is morally good by my subjective standard because it carried out its design with flawless execution. Even if the robot believed it was wrong to throw the cereal on the floor, siding with my son, he has done right by me, even if he has done wrong by his own standards. It's all a question of whose standard he follows, his or mine. But what if I gave the robot free will and it used that free will to refuse to do what I told it to do? It didn't push the cereal on the floor. Well, now the robot's in violation of its design. It no longer functions as intended. My son is happy, but he doesn't care about the robot in the first place. It's my toy, not his. So I determine that the robot is broken, and I'm going to tear it apart for scrap. I'm within my rights to do that. In this scenario, no one has the power or authority to stop me. So as its creator, my judgment on it is the only one that matters. Sure, my wife's subjective judgment that it's bad to throw cereal on the floor is a possibility in existence because she exists. But that's not the standard by which the robot will be judged. Because it failed in my design and intentions for it, I am the one to judge it, and the sentence of that judgment is that it be torn apart and used as scrap parts. Now, if I wanted to, I could have programmed it not to throw cereal on the floor. Suppose I did that, but my son's position is the opposite. She is the one, I think he meant he is the one who would find it hysterical and really hope it happens. I program it not to do it and give it free will and does it anyway. And he goes on and on and on and on. Then he goes on to Lucifer. I'll say this last paragraph and respond. God created the angels as his first children. And one of those, Lucifer, decided it would be really cool if his toys, us, defied our master because that would be amusing to him. Satan's standard of right and wrong is subjectively different from God's. But we will not be judged by Satan. We will be judged by God. So we are expected to live by God's standard. Satan has ever since been trying to confuse our standards so that we can no longer discern right from wrong by our Creator's standard. That is why God gave us the prophets, then Scripture, then his Son, his witnesses, and finally his Spirit, all to testify that God's will is all that matters and to tell us what that will is. Okay, let me say a few things about this and the robot and the magic robot and whatever. There are things I think I understand his point, and I will concur with those when I get there. But some things I'm unfortunately I just see it very differently. I don't like the analogy. The reason why I don't like the analogy is because I think it fails in what it's trying to demonstrate. On one level, on another level, I think it succeeds. Let me start where I think it succeeds. I think it succeeds in that the point is the owner has the right to do with what he wants to with the robot. Absolutely. God has the right to do with his creations as he sees fit. He absolutely does. As I just gave in my example earlier, God is under no moral obligation to make sure that we, his humans, are happy and fat and comfortable like we're his pets. God has no moral obligation for that. There's no standard to which he's appealing or someone's making him. He has no one's commanding him to make sure we're happy. No one's commanding him to make sure we live. Our lives are merely gift. And if he wants to stop thinking of us, he can. That's his moral prerogative. He has every right because because he brought us to being. If I went out in the backyard and dug out a bunch of dirt and made a mud snowman, I can destroy that mud snowman anytime I want to because I did it. It's mine. I'm under no moral obligation to do anything else. And that's absolutely true by your analogy. The problem is, of course, the example is what he gives as an analogy of what is right or wrong by the robot are not right and wrong things. So when he says, is the robot morally good or morally bad? The answer is neither. The robot is not morally good or bad because the examples he gives are not moral objective values. It is not objectively right or objectively wrong to put cereal on a floor. And you might say at one point, so, well, it made me laugh. That amusement has value to me, to my amusement. Okay, great. Well, to you. But the analogy breaks down because God's not that way. As far as we know from the God of the Bible and the God of the Father we find through the face of Jesus of Nazareth, God's value is not to be funny, to use us as pets, to make us learn tricks. So all the examples you give are petty. They're preferences. They're subjective preferences, not moral values. A better analogy is this. I create or develop a robot that rapes people. It rapes people. It's commanded to rape people. And you say, well, if I develop that robot that rapes people and it goes and does its job, is the robot morally good or bad? Well, if the creator made it that way, then it's good. Now, the response to that is, that's a horrible analogy because that's what could not happen. If God the creator would never make a robot that is designed to go rape because that's against God's moral character. Well, let's reverse it and say I made a robot that cannot ever rape because it's against the programming. And then someone else says, I want the robot to rape. Well, we have two different competing views. Well, the person who wants the robot to rape is simply wrong. Well, who are you to say that? Well, I am. There's in the analogy, the analogy breaks down because we're always bumping up against the absolute standard of right and wrong. It is always wrong to rape. Always wrong to rape. Always wrong to rape, which means that is objectively wrong. I don't need anybody else's opinion to tell me that it's right or wrong. It is wrong. Now, why do I think it's wrong? I think the concept of rape being wrong comes from God's very character and nature. So the analogy just breaks down on the fact that these are petty desires this robot creator has versus really good examples of morality. These aren't moral issues of whether or not someone's amused. That's not a moral issue. It's not a moral issue whether cereal's on the ground. So a better analogy is giving free will, and I've already said that. This last little bit about God creating angels as his children and Lucifer and stuff, I'm sorry to be disagreeable, I guess, but I disagree again. First off, I don't know who Lucifer is. I think Lucifer, he means Satan. Satan is never called Lucifer in the entire Bible, ever. Lucifer comes from the King James Version, lux fede, two Latin words. Lux fede means light bearer. It comes from Isaiah. I did a podcast on this. Go listen to my podcast. I think I did a blog as well on Lucifer, but he's never called Lucifer. It's not his name. So I think that's what he means, but I don't ever use that word because he's never called that. And then he says he thought it was really cool if we defied, and so Satan's standard of right wrong is subjectively different from God's and so forth. So like basically, who do we choose? Do we follow Satan? Do we follow God? Well, first off, these things like he thought it was really cool. Well, the Bible doesn't say he thinks it's really cool. So he's putting motivations in Satan's thoughts that we simply don't have. And I don't do that. But anyway, then he says, we'll not be judged by Satan, we'll be judged by God. So we're expected to live by God's standard. Well, the answer is that's right. That's right. We will be judged by God because God created us. Satan did not create us. The Creator is the objective standard of all right and wrong, not any other creature. Not any other creature. So I'm not sure how that proves a point at all. The point is, God is right, and everybody else who says anything else is wrong. And like I've said in other podcasts, God cannot randomly, arbitrarily choose a different set of moral values because those moral values come from his very character. He can't change his character because it is his character. I cannot choose to think like a African 12-year-old girl because I'm not an African 12-year-old girl. I'm not, and I cannot be. I can't. I can only make decisions based on the character as defunct it is right now, but that's it. And God, we get God the way he is, not the way we might want him to be. But just because he has moral values doesn't mean God always is under the same moral obligation like we are. And that's where people get a lot of confusion right there. For example, I'll say this and pause for this podcast to say it one more time. People think all the time they condemn God. If God were good, he would have saved those children in that flood. He would not. He would have disallowed that. And you say, well, why is that? Well, because everybody knows it's the right thing to do. But see, the questioner, the person who's condemning God, assumes that God is under the same moral obligation as we are. It's like saying, if David were good, he would never have slashed his tires. And someone said, why do you say that? And the person said, because everybody knows it's good not to slash someone else's tires. You see what that assumes? It assumes this the same moral obligation regardless of the situation. And that's false. It's false. Since the truck is mine, I can do with it as I will. Well, we are all God's trucks. We are all God's tires. The moral obligation that God has upon us is not the same as how we treat other people. It's just not the same. Our lives are gifts. That's all they are. And God is under no moral obligation whatsoever to make sure we live a long, happy, prosperous life. And the fact, well, I'm going for a long time there, but I'm going to pause there for now. All right, well, that's enough. I'm going to do it in part 2. We'll finish this long email, and I hope you'll follow up to part 2. God bless you. See you next time. Thank you so much for listening to the podcast. I really do hope that you enjoyed it. I hope you'll listen more. If you want more, go to davidpendergrass.com. There are tabs at the top that let you have access to all the podcasts I've recorded, to sermons I've done, books I've written. They're all there at davidpendergrass.com. You can also check me out on Facebook, facebook.com/glimpse of the kingdom, facebook.com/glimpse of the kingdom, and also look at my Twitter feed at glimpse the kingdom or at Dr. D. Pendergrass, at Dr. D. Pendergrass. There's tons of ways to reach out. I hope you will. Send me your questions, send me your comments. If you'd like to support the ministries of Glimpse of the Kingdom, you can also find ways to give online on davidpendergrass.com. If you'd like for me to come and do some consulting, check out my website, davidpendergrassconsulting.com, and I'll be happy to come out and speak to your organization and help and train any way I can. God bless you. See you online.